I am so moved today and so grateful. And I was reflecting on what it means, health and wellness in the 2020s. And, I often start a talk with this, and that is, we are living in remarkable times. And I'm reflecting on every year, every month, every moment. That's still a true statement. We are living in remarkable times. And as I reflect on the last couple of years since we entered 2020, I don't think any of us in 2019 could have said, I know what's coming in the early 2020s. And yet we've had this experience, this collective experience. And I hold that it is absolutely true that we are in the midst of a profound awakening. And sometimes a profound awakening is uncomfortable. Sometimes it's filled with joy. Sometimes it's filled with ahas and insights. And sometimes it's filled with, ooh, wow, look at this. Look at this idea I've been holding about myself and the world, and look how I'm seeing it everywhere. And I think the talk, the reading, the affirmations, the prayers have all led to one key concept that I want to start with, and it's profoundly simple. When I understand very deeply the truth of who and what I am, the entire universe changes in an instant. And what I once called reality now becomes illusion. And what I once called illusion becomes reality. And for many of us, we have that spontaneous insight, a moment of awareness where we touch reality. And then maybe we spend the majority of the rest of our lives trying to figure out what just happened. Or maybe we go into our mind and try to make sense of it. Or maybe we even go into our mind and try to come up with a formula for how to experience that reality again. And what I want to offer as we begin this conversation about health and wellness and wholeness, for that matter, in the 2020s, is that recognition that what we're speaking about today is we're talking about this through the lens of reality with a capital R. And so for those of us who consider ourselves New Thought students or New Thought practitioners or New Thought, I'm going to say beers, being that message, being the beacons of that, being the lighthouse that's standing in the midst of this greater reality. For those of us who have been in this teaching, this New Thought ancient wisdom teaching for any time, we understand the concept of what we call relative and ultimate reality. And ultimate reality is profoundly simple, that it is, as Sharon D. Henderson so beautifully sang, from the inside. That the truth of who and what we are is a magnificent and infinite being, a spiritual essence, a spark of divinity. And everything that we can see, touch, taste with our five senses is actually only relative reality. So sometimes the mind is a little trickster, isn't it? For me, I'll speak for myself. Sometimes my mind is a little trickster, and I see something and I think, oh, that's real. Or then I come into New Thought teachings, and this is my journey. I come into New Thought teachings and I start saying, that's not real. And then I woke up, or I continue to wake up, or I have a spontaneous insight where I recognize that the master recognizes that it's both real and unreal. And that as we awaken to a greater reality, a greater truth, we understand that what we see in relative reality isn't unreal. It is only one version of reality. And as we go down this rabbit hole, we recognize that as we touch that inner reality, that greater truth, that infinite beingness that we are, we begin to witness and observe relative reality with an understanding that it's actually a hologram. And that each of us is projecting a different reality onto this blank screen. In other words, like I said in the reading, we come to understand that we all hold a different perspective about the world. And then we come together in groups and we share that perspective of the world. And then we build community sometimes around a shared perspective. That's called a political party. That's called a religion. That might be a spiritual community. It might be a support group. We come into agreement in relative reality, and we begin to speak from that relative reality. And sometimes we speak about it like it's the truth. rather than this is how I perceive what I'm seeing. And that fundamental awareness is life-changing, because with that fundamental shift comes ultimate compassion. Because then I'm not wondering who's right and who's wrong. I'm not wondering what ways I'm right or I'm wrong. And I'm not looking at a group of people and saying, well, they're wrong. They're wrong about this. The fundamental issue, the core issue of conflict, whether that's internal conflict, our personal relationships, or global conflict is always based in duality. This is mine, you can't take it. Even if that's a thought, a belief, or an idea, this party, this political party, or this group of people have decided this is what's real, and we solidify that in relative reality. So if you turn on the news, you're going to get different versions of reality based on which channel you find yourself landing upon. And sometimes, for me, early on, I was like, how can this be? How can this news station have this story that seems so real? And by the way, they have facts to back it up, don't they? And then this other station has this whole other story about what just happened, and they have the facts to back that up. And so I started becoming aware that life is perception. Life is what we call it. And so if I'm in the midst of a global situation that we've all been working through, some of us may have been fighting it, some of us may have been in the flow of it. When we recognize that it's what we call it that creates the experience of it, there is a fundamental shift. And the moment I call something horrible, I begin to experience it as horrible. The moment I try to pretend that it's not happening, I also create duality, like, oh, that's not real. I remember a friend of mine who was just new thought said, germs are not real. That's my affirmation. And so I said, well, how's that working for you? There's something else though, and that is, yes, they're real, but they're not the ultimate truth. And we have walked through a time, and I would say we probably continue to walk through a time where there's a collective narrative. And by the way, there are about 100,000 at least collective narratives about what's happening. And if you agree with one, you might be called a conspiracy theorist, or if you agree with one, you might be, oh, you must be this. You must be in that group. And if we say, wait a minute, I hold the New Thought teachings to be ultimate reality. And that ultimate reality is there is something within me, there is something within each of us that is more powerful than anything happening in relative reality. And as I observe life through that lens, I see everything as an opportunity to awaken. I think it would, and we don't know if Buddha really said this, but it is said that Buddha said when someone asked, are you a man or a god? And he said, I am awake. So what does awake mean? Awake to me means I understand that relative reality is happening, but it's not the ultimate truth. The ultimate truth is my beingness, my essential self. And we understand now that when we have a deep awareness and we tune into that frequency, that affects everything, not just in our own bodies, in our minds, in our hearts, but in the world itself. And this is very powerful and important, because I'm going to name this. And I want to say that if you hear what I'm about to say through the lens of ego, this might even sound a little controversial. If you hear this through the lens that I am attempting to deliver it, I'm delivering this from the New Thought, ancient wisdom teaching of oneness, of essential beingness. And that is, there's something more powerful within each and every one of us than anything happening in the world. And that includes a virus, that includes the narrative of divisiveness, that includes the ideas of us and them and good and bad and right and wrong. I want to be clear what I'm saying. I'm not saying none of that is happening, nor am I saying it doesn't exist. What I am saying is, as soon as I have a judgment, now judgment can be like, oh, it's a beautiful day. That's a judgment, all right? Or a judgment can be, how dare they? How dare they do that? They don't care about other people. They're horrible. When I say that, or even if I think it or feel the energy of that, that contributes to that on planet Earth. And I don't want to say this through the lens of self-criticism or judgment, because that blame is one of the lowest forms of consciousness. So if I go into blaming myself for having a perspective, I'm just continuing the downward cycle. When I interrupt it and say, oh, isn't it interesting that I'm having a thought of division? Isn't it interesting that I'm having a thought of fear? Isn't it interesting I'm believing that my thoughts are who I am rather than what I have? And from that place, see, I have witnessed, and this is the thing that could be perceived as controversial if you're hearing it through the lens of ego, I have witnessed a lot of us in the New Thought movement slip into collective consciousness of fear. Because I've seen what we post, I've seen what we share, I've seen what we're saying to each other, I've heard what we're saying to each other. And sometimes maybe we've slipped into, oh gosh, I have to, maybe it's even that I think I have to say this publicly, otherwise I might get canceled, or otherwise someone might judge me. And yet, what is required right now on planet Earth is to recognize what's happening in the world, not to pretend that it's not happening or jump into some collective story that makes it sound like we're in some conspiracy theory, but in the midst of that, stand in a greater reality, the reality of oneness, the reality that there is something stronger in me, something truer in me that is way beyond anything happening in the world. And when I do that, when each of us does that, we actually are living the New Thought, ancient teaching, wisdom. We are living that. We are being that in the world. And then we begin to see the profound shift that that creates in our own thinking, our own emotions, in our own bodies, and in the world itself. We start to become not only a ripple effect, but we instantaneously, we are part of a global shift in consciousness. And it's happening. And it's happening in such a powerful way that the ego that lives in each of us and collectively in some groups is like, no, we're not changing. We're holding on to this old way of being. And if you're hearing me say it's only one group of people doing that, I want to invite us to expand a little bit and ask, is there any way that my group is doing that? Is there any way that the group that I'm associated with is continuing to propagate stories of division, of fear, of separation? We must be afraid. We are other than. Now, the mind is fascinating because even my mind in that moment had a little uh-oh. What am I saying? Am I actually saying that it's not about my thoughts, it's not about my emotions, it's not even about my body, it's about something greater? So I'm gonna say, yes, that is what I'm saying. And so I often talk about this, but I talk about the 4 rooms of existence. And Robert, in his wonderful meditation today, that reading actually spoke to it. And the 4 rooms of existence, I like acronyms, so I call it PIES: physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. And when it comes to health and well-being in the 2020s, especially in 2020 itself, what I saw is most, not all of us, but most people jumped right into the physical room only. Wellness and health only lives in the physical. And so collectively, we put things into place that protected us physically. And of course, people could say, well, yes, we needed to do that. Yes, and what did that do to us mentally or intellectually? What did that do to the mental well-being? See, sometimes in our culture, when we say health and wellness, we think of the body only. We think of our physical well-being. And as a matter of fact, if you look at Western medicine, not only does it mostly only focus on the physical, but it really mostly only focuses on the symptoms of the physical. And then we treat the symptoms of the physical. And those of us who are holistic practitioners recognize that unless we become curious about the root of what we might call disease, the root of what's happening in our bodies, we're only continuing to treat symptoms and not actually getting down to what is happening. I read an article recently that stated that there are humans on planet Earth right now that will probably live to be 200. And these are from medical doctors, because as we eradicate disease, the body is naturally going to live longer. And so that's the physical, right? And when we only focus on the physical, which is where a lot of medicine lives, and it has a place, of course. You know, if I'm in an accident and I'm bleeding, yes, I want a doctor to help me patch that up. There's no doubt that the symptom is something important to look at. And in addition to that, what else is happening here? I had the opportunity to have lunch this weekend. I'm in Baltimore this weekend at a conference, and I had lunch with my friend, Dr. Mel Pohl, and he is a pain specialist. And he and I were talking a little bit at lunch about the placebo effect. And he said something that's really fascinating to me. He said, even when in a study, in a clinical study, even when someone is told this pill you're about to take is a placebo, they still have a better rate of healing and of getting better in terms of their symptoms. That's so powerful. Even if they're being told this is a sugar pill, for example, there is still something about taking that helps them to become well. That's so powerful. And of course, most of us that are here today at Agape Bay Area, virtually or in the room, already understand this. But I want us to lean into that for a moment, because what we're shifting to, most likely, is the power of the mind. So we shift from the physical room to the intellectual room. What I'm thinking about my body, what I'm thinking about a virus, what I'm thinking, even about division in the world, what I'm thinking about that creates something not only in my mind, but it affects the body. And this is not news to any of us, right? Look at Joe Dispenza's work. Look at Dr. Sue Morter's work. The mind, look at, for that matter, look at New Thought teachings that emerged over a century ago. The mind creates a different reality. The mind affects the body. Even, and when I say even Western medicine, it's not meant to be a judgment. It's really a recognition that there's an evolution happening. So in Western medicine, they're beginning to recognize the person's mindset makes a difference. And that's where a lot of us actually stop the conversation. What I want to invite is to look at these other rooms as well. We're looking at the emotional room. What feelings are present? And true holistic care to me is understanding that we have all four aspects and that we want to spend time in each of them. If you're anything like me, I wanted to abandon the physical and only go to the thought when I was new thought. Oh, that's not really happening. Like I recently broke my finger, and that's a true story. And I could tell that story later because I went to like, oh, this doesn't hurt. And then I looked down a few hours later and whoa, my body was telling me it was broken. So yes, I went to the doctor. Yes, they looked at it. Yes, I got x-rays. But early in my evolution, I would say, oh, that's not real. My finger's not broken. I'm going to pretend like it's not because the mind is more powerful. And then I recognized that the mind has a role in how the body heals. And then we move into the emotional room. And many of us, sometimes even in New Thought, we don't really go into that room as often. And yet the emotional room, the heart center, holds a frequency. And so if I'm only in my physical or my mental, intellectual, without also honoring the emotional, then my house is out of balance. And so as I allow myself to feel what's present and truly allow myself to have the emotional experience without attaching a story to it, emotions are a physical sensation in the body, letting us know something needs attention. Many of us go into a story that I shouldn't be feeling this, or what's the root of this? How do I get rid of it? Again, that model of, ooh, the symptom is sadness. I must be rid of sadness. Even depression and anxiety, which we could say live in the mind, or we could say live in the emotional center. Maybe it's both. Sometimes we think we must get rid of this. There's something wrong with this. And yet when I embrace it, when I work with it rather than against it, something really powerful happens. And then the emotional center has a role. And what I want to talk about in my last few minutes here is what happens when we also tap into the spiritual room. So again, pies, physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. When I tap into the spiritual room, which is infinite beingness, which is, as Reverend Michael says, a blueprint for our life, an individual blueprint, or we could say infinite beingness, source, God, love, all these different names, light. When I tap into that, and I live primarily from this place, it affects the emotions. It affects my thoughts. It affects my body. It affects physical reality in the world. And then I can have a new awareness. There's a framework that I love, and that framework is every day I destroy and uncreate everything that preceded this moment. Now, for some of us, a new thought, ooh, destroy and uncreate, that almost sounds violent. I love it because it's like, oh, wow, that's a thought from yesterday. Let me uncreate that and tap into spiritual essence. And then spiritual essence starts to inform my emotions and starts to inform my thoughts and starts to inform my physicality. And so I can get out of the debate of what we should do about a virus or about the division in the world, and we can say, rather than looking at it through the lens of right and wrong, I'm going to look at it through the lens of my spiritual room, and I'm going to have a different awareness. And because of that, a different awareness, I can actually contribute to the world rather than trying to change the world. And when I land in the place of the spiritual awareness, that is the foundational principle of every New Thought teaching. There is one power and one presence. Spiritual essence is at the core of who and what I am, and at the core of every living being. That means every living being, even the ones I have judgment about. Judgment shows up as disease in the body. Judgment constricts, curiosity opens. And so rather than looking for a group of like-minded people, what if I looked for a group of people, and some of us have, look for a group of people who are dedicated to living as spirit in the world. I have friends who have very different opinions than I do about the world. And there was a time that I wouldn't have been able to be their friends because I disagreed with them, you see. And with that disagreement came judgment. And I think it's Nietzsche who said, within this every judgment, there is a seed of revenge. Within every judgment, there is a seed of revenge. I must tell them how they're wrong. But these friends that I have that have different opinions, that's only in the intellectual room. In the spiritual room, I have friends who are dedicated to their own transformation, to being love in the world. They have a different way of interpreting how they do that. And yet that dedication creates a bond and a deep connection. And so in closing, what I want to say, as we move into truly holistic care, physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual, we can become curious about what gets created when I focus only on one of those. And what gets created for me when I anchor in the spiritual room and then allow that to spiritualize all the other rooms, then I can become a beacon for that in the world. And that is what is required in the world right now. I can be more compassionate, more open, and more understanding. I move from disagreement to curiosity, really hearing someone. Not that I'm going to change my point of view, but that I'm going to recognize that there's something greater here. And as we radiate this love into the world instantly changes because, again, it's the world of our perception. And to me, that's the way that healing has always happened on the planet. It has always been anchored in oneness, connection, and love, not in judgment and being at war. So rather than fighting a virus or a disease or a division, seeming division, or the message of division, we can stand in the midst of that as love, as spiritual essence. And from that, we can observe it. We can participate in a new way. I'm not trying to change someone. I'm trying to become curious about how I can contribute a different message, a different energy, and a different frequency. So with that,